Hello, welcome back to my second tutorial. Today, we are going to rig this little mechanical eye using constraint and creating controllers to make it easier to use. And hopefully, at the end of it, you will have some idea of what kind of workflow I use to rig my models. I'm going to start by organizing my mesh. Right now, it's just different separate objects. For better control, I would like to move the eyelids apart from the main eye's structure, have a default position for each object, and then merge all in just one mesh. Pressing Shift A, I am going to open the Add menu to create the armature. Then, in the object properties, I am going to enable the In Front option, so they will always be visible in front of the objects. Let's start with the armature edition. I am going to rename and duplicate the bones in order to have the necessary to move the little box, the eye, and the eyelids. When duplicating the eyelid, after I set the position, I will press the right mouse button to end the duplicate process. This will leave the new bone in the original position. And once again, rename the bones. Never skip this part, and it's going to make your job less complicated when assigning the bones to the mesh. Time to link our mesh to our armature. After selecting your mesh and then your armature, press Ctrl P to open the parenting options and select the With Empty Group Armature Deformation. This will create one empty group in our object for each bone the armature have, and it's going to have the same names. To make the connection between the bone and the mesh, we must select our mesh element, the vertex group, and press Assign. For a quick selection, I'm using the L shortcut over the object to select all the vertex connected to a surface where the mouse is pointing. Also, keep in mind that the vertex could have multiple vertex groups, so remember to deselect the meshes before moving to the next group. And when you're done, you can give it a try in the armature pose mode. We're not really going to use it later, since those bones are going to work with constraints, but I am going to lock some transform parameters for now. This prevents you from being able to move your object along the locked axis with the transform tools. I'm going to use the clear transform options on pose mode to return the selected bones to their default transform values before continuing. Now, after selecting what is going to be our target bone and then our owner bone, I'm going to press Ctrl Shift C to open the constraint panel and select copy location. This is going to happen to the rest of their eyelids. Copy location is going to force the owner to have the same position as the target, especially if it's set up in workspace. Something I would like to do now is use the root bone as a pattern for the rest, that way I can move everything around. For that, I must go back to Armature Edit mode, select all the bones I want as a child, and at last select the root bone. Then press Ctrl B to open the parenting menu and select Quick Offset. On pose mode, you will see that now when moving the root bone, the rest of the bones move it too. You can also notice that I completely forget to link the rest of the mesh to the bones. Back on the Object Edit mode, I'm going to select the remaining mesh and add it to the vertex group called Root. And there you got it. All moved together now. And it's time to create some bones as controller, starting by duplicating, aligning, and renaming one of the existing bones. We want our eye to rotate to follow the position of the bone controller, so we select the controller first as the target and the eye bone next to work as the owner. Press Ctrl Shift C to open the constraint menu and select Damp Trap. With Damp Trap, you make one of the local axes of the owner to always point towards the target. By default, it points to the target head. The axis could be X, Y, and Z, and you could use negative axis directions. After duplicating, aligning, and panning the new bone to control the dog eyelid rotation, I am going to add the transformation constraint to the dog eyelid using this new bone as the target. Transformation constraint allows us to compare a transformed property of the target to the same or another property of the owner. In this case, we are going to use local spacing both to make the location Y of the target rotates the owner in Z-axis. We also mark the rotation mix as replace since we want to fully control the rotation from here. Now, when moving the controller up and down, the eyelid rotates, but it still needs some adjustments. Before moving to the next controller, I'm adding the limit location constraint to fully restrict some of the axis movement and limit how much this bone can move up and down. Now it's limited, so I don't need to worry about going out of the distance needed, and since it's a child of the eye direction controller, I can easily move all together. For the bottom eyelid, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to duplicate, align, rename the bone and apply the transformation constraint with similar but not the same values as the other one. The biggest difference is that we are going to use negative values. We could probably use the same value if the bone's local axis were pointing in other directions. We are also going to apply negative values for the limit location constraint. I completely forget about this, and this is why it's important to set the rotation mix to replace here. With that, the rotation generated by the constraint is added to the actual transform rotation. For the vertical eyelids, we are going to follow the same workflow with different values for the constraints. But in this case, I will also control only one of them, and the other is just going to copy the rotation. To make this bone copy the rotation as I mentioned, we need to select the target, select the owner, open the constraint menu and select copy rotation constraint. Set the space to local, and for this it's just going to be the x-axis inverted. And those are all the bones and controllers I would like to add to this smart rigging model. Now let's try some things to check if everything is working correctly. Something to fix first is that I want to control the move all together when I move the root bone, and for that I just need to make the controller child of my root bone. After parenting the bones, I can move, rotate and even scale all together with the root bone. Something to do next is limiting the eye controller location. I'm going to position the controller manually first to get the reference value to use in the constraint, and set the owner to local space. In that way, it is going to be affected in its own axis even when the root bone is moved, rotated or scaled. Now, for the final detail, let's put the bones we don't really need to control the model in another layer. That is going to give us some clean look of what we should move around. That's it for this little rigging tutorial. Some extra content I would like to show you is how you can make a little wall with those eyes and make them point in one direction. After selecting the mesh and the armature, I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate a couple of them. For the target direction, I'm going to use an empty object and change the shape to a sphere. What we need to happen is that all the eye controllers must follow the empty object position. First, we are going to make it work with one of them by adding the copy location constraint in pose mode and using the empty object as a target. We also need to be sure that the copy location constraint is first and the limit location is next, otherwise the limit location is going to be ignored. Here an example of what happens if the constraint order is different. To apply this to the rest of the bones, we must select all the armatures, select the bones we wanted to be affected by the constraint, and at last, select the bone with the constraint. Now, we can apply the option Copy Constraints to selected bones from the Pose menu. And there you have it. They are following now. I hope you liked this second tutorial. If you are interested in more mechanical rigging content, you can see more in my social networks. But also, if you would like to check them yourself, there is some Blender files with rigged mechanism available for free following the links in the description. Thank you for coming and see you in the next video.